It began with smoke, not the smoke of cannons or muskets, but the lazy, perfumed haze of opium pipes drifting through the ports of Canton. By the time the British Empire noticed, it wasn't trade anymore. It was addiction, an addiction so vast, so profitable, that when China tried to stop it, Britain went to war to keep it going. The year was 1839. At the edges of the Qing Empire, the Pearl River shimmered beneath the subtropical sun, carrying junks and sampans heavy with porcelain, silk and tea. For centuries, China had been the world's factory, and Britain its best customer, an empire addicted to Chinese luxury. But there was a problem: silver. Britain's vaults were emptying at a terrifying rate. Every chest of tea meant more silver flowing eastward, enriching China while draining Britain's treasury. And so, London's merchants and politicians found a terrible solution. They would sell addiction to pay for tea. In the low, humid plains of Bengal, where the morning mist clung to the river banks like ghosts unwilling to depart, entire fields shimmered with the pale green sheen of poppies swaying under the tropical sun. Millions upon millions of them, cultivated under the watchful eyes of the East India Company's overseers, whose ledgers were filled not with moral reflection, but with numbers, quantities, and profit margins. These were not flowers of beauty, but of empire. Their milky sap, coaxed by the calloused hands of farmers who had little choice but to obey, would be dried, pressed, and moulded into blocks of opium, small, heavy bricks of darkness destined to change the fate of two great civilizations. By the time the harvests were done, the opium was loaded into wooden chests marked with the company's insignia, each one packed so tightly that when the lids were nailed shut, the faint, bitter scent of resin still leaked through the seams. These chests were carried down the rivers of India, past villages that had been hollowed out by debt, to the bustling colonial ports of Calcutta and Bombay, where British merchants, with polished boots and ledgers under their arms, supervised the loading of their ships as if they were dealing in tea or textiles rather than despair. Out on the docks the heat shimmered against the water, and the smell of tar, salt, and poppy sap mingled into a haze that seemed to hang over the entire enterprise like a curse. The sailors, sweating under the weight of their cargo, knew little and cared less about what they were carrying, only that the voyage to Canton promised good pay and the possibility of escape from poverty. Above them, the Union Jack fluttered faintly in the monsoon wind, a symbol of power and prestige now serving as a banner for a trade that would rot the soul of a nation. When the British ships reached the South China Sea, their holds were full not of silver or spices, but of carefully packed opium bricks. Contraband in every legal sense, yet tolerated, encouraged, and insured by the most powerful empire on earth. Their destination was Canton, the single port still open to foreign trade, where Chinese merchants known as the Hong served as intermediaries between the outside world and the inner sanctum of the Qing Empire. The British had long been dependent on Chinese tea, porcelain, and silk, luxuries that filled the drawing rooms of London, but the exchange had always been uneven. Silver flowed endlessly eastward, enriching China while impoverishing Britain. And so, somewhere between desperation and greed, a solution had been found: to feed the Chinese people the very drug that was draining their strength, to reverse the current of wealth by flooding the Middle Kingdom with smoke. By the 1830s, that smoke had become an epidemic. In the tea houses of Canton and the fishing villages of Fujian, in the barracks of soldiers and the bedrooms of scholars, the faint, sweet smell of opium drifted through the night like incense from a dying civilization. Men who once studied the classics now sat motionless in clouds of vapor, their fingers trembling as they held their pipes. Fishermen forgot the tides, clerks abandoned their ledgers, soldiers pawned their weapons for another dose. Addiction seeped through the empire like water through silk, softly, invisibly, but unstoppable. The emperor, Dao Guang, had watched with growing horror as reports arrived from the provinces. Families ruined, taxes unpaid, soldiers collapsing at their posts. Foreign poison, his ministers called it. The emperor demanded action, but within his own administration corruption ran deep. Officials who condemned opium by day smoked it by night, and the merchants of Canton bribed their way past every law meant to stop them. And so Daoguang turned to one man whose reputation shone brighter than any banner in the empire, Lin Zexu, the governor of Hubei and Hunan, known for his unbending moral character and his ability to confront vice without fear. When Lin arrived in Canton in the spring of 1839, he came not with soldiers but with letters, stern proclamations written in calligraphy so precise that even the paper seemed to tremble under the weight of their authority. He addressed not only the Chinese traders but the foreign merchants themselves, urging them to surrender their opium voluntarily, to spare China from further humiliation and decay. But the British refused. Their profit margins were too vast, their connections too powerful, and their arrogance too complete. To them, the Chinese were simply another market, another obstacle to be removed in the name of commerce and civilization. And so, Lin Zexu acted. Over several weeks, under the blinding sun and the watchful eyes of thousands, his men confiscated more than 20,000 chests of opium, each one dragged from the godowns and warehouses of the foreign traders, rolled across the docks and piled high in great mounds by the river's edge. There, under his personal supervision, the chests were broken open, the resinous bricks smashed and dissolved in a mixture of lime, salt, and water, until the Pearl River itself turned black and acrid, the air thick with the stench of wasted fortune. The tide carried the poison away, and for a brief moment China breathed again. To the Chinese it was an act of purification, a cleansing of the nation's spirit. To the British it was an unforgivable insult to commerce, and in the smoke that rose from the poisoned river one could already see the shadow of war. When the black waters of the Pearl River finally cleared, and the last trace of opium had been washed out to sea, the British merchants anchored off Canton were left staring at their ruined fortunes, their decks empty, their ledgers meaningless. They sent letters of outrage across the oceans, to Calcutta, to London, to the Parliament itself, letters written in the ink of greed and humiliation, crying, not over the moral wound of addiction, but over the destruction of profit. In London, those letters landed on desks that smelled of leather and pipe smoke, in offices lined with maps and portraits of empire. Politicians, merchants, and aristocrats all read the same phrase repeated over and over: British property has been destroyed by a foreign power. And to them, that was reason enough for war. Never mind that the property in question was poison. Never mind that it had been sold illegally. What mattered was that British merchants had been insulted, and the British flag had been defied. The press fanned the flames, printing stories that cast Lin Zexu as a tyrant, the Qing Empire as barbaric, and the British traders as innocent men defending the sacred principles of free trade. The phrase itself, free trade, was repeated like a hymn, as though it were a moral cause and not a shield for drug smuggling. By late 1839, Britain had decided the Royal Navy would sail east, not to defend freedom, but to enforce addiction. They called it a punitive expedition. History would later call it the First Opium War. Far away, in the tropical humidity of the South China Sea, word of Britain's decision arrived like distant thunder. Canton's harbours filled with anxious whispers. The Chinese officials had no navy worthy of the name, only coastal junks armed with a few old cannons and brave men who had never seen a frigate. The British, meanwhile, prepared their fleet in India and Singapore, sleek iron-braced ships with black hulls and white sails, their decks lined with cannons capable of firing a dozen rounds before a Chinese vessel could reload once. When the first British squadron appeared off the coast of China in the summer of 1840, it was like the arrival of a storm from another world. Their flags were crisp in the wind, their hulls gleamed with oiled wood and brass, and the sound of their drums carried over the sea like the heartbeat of an empire. They were not here to negotiate. They were here to make the world understand what it meant to stand in the way of British commerce. From the decks of those ships, officers in starched white uniforms peered through spyglasses at the coastlines of an empire that had once believed itself eternal. The Chinese soldiers waiting on shore wore padded armour and carried matchlocks and spears, symbols of a time when warfare still depended on courage more than machinery. They had faith in the strength of the emperor, in the righteousness of their cause, and in the divine balance of heaven. But none of that could stop a shell fired from a 32-pounder cannon. When the bombardments began, the noise was unlike anything China had ever heard. The sky cracked open. Fortifications exploded into dust. Men ran blindly through the smoke as the British broadsides tore through their ranks, shattering walls and wooden ships alike, the air filled with the screams of the wounded and the whistling of shrapnel. Lin Zexu, still stationed in Canton, sent desperate reports to the emperor pleading for reinforcements, for weapons, for anything that could stand against the iron monsters that now ruled the seas. But the imperial bureaucracy moved slowly, and the British ships moved fast. Within months they controlled the southern coastline, blockading ports, cutting off trade, and seizing cities with an ease that shocked even themselves. The war was not a contest of armies. It was a collision of centuries. On one side stood an ancient empire bound by ritual, Confucian ideals, and a deep belief in moral order. On the other stood a modern industrial power, armed with steam engines, rifled cannons, and an unshakable conviction that profit justified everything. As the months passed, the British fleet moved north, bombarding city after city, Amoy, Ningbo, Zhoushan, each one falling like a domino before superior firepower. Local officials surrendered, fled, or were executed for cowardice. And still, the emperor refused to believe that heaven had abandoned him. At last, in 1841, the British struck at the mouth of the Yangtze River, threatening the heart of China itself. Panic spread through the imperial court. The once proud nation that had looked down upon all foreigners as barbarians now found itself humiliated, its people terrorized, its soldiers helpless, before ships they could barely comprehend. And somewhere, in a London tea-house, a merchant lifted his cup and smiled, knowing that every sip of tea now carried with it the taste of another nation's suffering. By the summer of 1842, the once proud dragon of China lay exhausted, bleeding along its vast wounded coast. The sound of British cannons had become the sound of inevitability, a deep, rhythmic thunder that rolled across the deltas and river mouths, echoing through the temples and tea-houses of a nation that could not understand how a handful of foreign ships had brought an empire of hundreds of millions to its knees. The Pearl River Delta was no longer a place of trade, but of surrender. Villages burned, fleets sank, and cities fell one by one, until even the mandarins of the imperial court, those men in embroidered robes who had once dismissed all foreigners as outer barbarians, now spoke in whispers of terms, indemnities, and concessions. By August, British warships had anchored at the mouth of the Yangtze, and their cannon barrels pointed directly toward Nanking, the ancient capital, the city of dynasties, the heart of China's soul. There would be no more battles, only signatures. Inside the cabin of HMS Cornwallis, under the sweltering heat of the southern summer, British envoys sat at a long wooden table polished to a mirror shine. Opposite them, the Chinese delegation, weary, humiliated, and aware that every word they spoke would be carved into history, placed their seals on the parchment that would end the war. The document was short, cold, and merciless. It was called the Treaty of Nanking. Under its terms, China was forced to pay a massive indemnity, over 21 million silver dollars, a sum so vast that it would drain the empire's treasury for years to come. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were to be opened permanently to British trade. British merchants would be allowed to live there freely, under their own laws, beyond the reach of Chinese authority. And then came the final clause, written in neat, unfeeling script. The island of Hong Kong is hereby ceded to Her Britannic Majesty in perpetuity. It was, perhaps, the cruelest irony of all, that a war fought to preserve the right to sell drugs had ended with the birth of one of the most famous cities in the British Empire. Hong Kong, a barren island of rocky hills and fishing huts, would soon become a glittering outpost of global commerce, its foundations built on the ashes of Chinese pride. When news of the treaty reached Beijing, the Emperor Daoguang locked himself in his chambers for 3 days. He refused food. He refused counsel. Witnesses later said they could hear him weeping behind the walls of the Forbidden City, a sound few had ever imagined possible from the Son of Heaven. He had believed that China was eternal, that the celestial empire stood above the squabbles of the barbarian West. Now he knew that the age of isolation was over. The rivers that once carried silk and porcelain to the world would now carry opium and gunboats, and for the next century, China would be carved and divided by foreign powers, British, French, American, Russian, and later Japanese, each taking their share of the wounded giant, each leaving scars that would not heal. Yet even in defeat, something stirred in the soul of the empire. In the tea-houses and marketplaces, in the ports and provinces, whispers began to spread, whispers of self-strengthening, of modern armies and industry, of learning from the enemy, not out of admiration but out of necessity. Because history, like smoke, does not disappear. It lingers, it seeps, it waits. And the war that began with opium, that sweet, deadly haze, would not only change China, but the world itself. It marked the beginning of an age where trade was more powerful than faith, where cannon fire decided diplomacy, and where empires could be built not only with swords, but with smoke. In the years that followed, the smoke never really cleared. It drifted across oceans and generations, leaving behind a faint, invisible stain that no treaty could wash away. In the parlours of London, the same men who had once justified the trade with words like commerce and progress now sipped their tea in silence, never thinking of the hands that had paid for it, the hollowed faces of addicts in Canton, the farmers in Bengal forced to grow the flowers of death instead of food for their children, the sailors who carried poison across seas in the name of civilization. Empire, they said, was destiny. But in truth, it was desire. Desire dressed in the robes of righteousness, draped in the language of honour and law. The war that Britain fought against China was not a war of necessity, it was a war of appetite. A hunger not for survival, but for control, for profit, for prestige, for the illusion that the sun could never set on a nation that had learned how to turn misery into wealth. And the opium itself, that delicate, deadly substance, became a mirror for the age. It soothed the pain it created, it silenced the conscience it awakened, it lulled empires and emperors alike into dreams of permanence. In China, the humiliation of the Opium Wars would linger for more than a century, shaping revolutions and rebellions, reformers and emperors alike. The Qing dynasty, once radiant with ceremony and divine legitimacy, began to unravel, its banners faded, its palaces hollowed, its people restless. And yet, through that suffering, a new kind of awakening began, slow, painful, and inevitable. In the West, the victory over China became a kind of silence too, a silence that history rarely breaks. Textbooks call it the opening of China to trade, as if it were a simple economic transaction and not the forced addiction of millions. But beneath the polite language of diplomacy lies the truth. It was the moment when commerce became a weapon, and the global age began not with progress, but with smoke. When you look at the world today, the glittering towers of Hong Kong, at the global highways of trade that link continents like veins, somewhere in that shining machinery, the ghosts of that first war still linger. They stand on the docks of Canton, they drift along the Pearl River, they whisper through the corridors of forgotten opium dens and through the ledgers of long-dead merchants. And perhaps, in the quiet hours of the night, when the city lights dim and the air feels heavy, you can still sense it. That faint sweetness of burning poppy, that sigh of empire, that distant reminder that even the greatest civilizations can be undone not by enemies or invasions, but by the temptations they cannot resist. The war began with smoke, and in a way the world we live in was born from it. Long after the cannons went silent and the treaties were signed, the true cost of the Opium Wars continued to unfold. Not in battlefields or ledgers, but in the slow decay of human souls. In the quiet alleys of Canton, the smokehouses still glowed faintly through the night, their paper lanterns swaying in the sea breeze. Men sat motionless inside, their faces yellowed and hollow, their eyes glazed over like glass, breathing in the same poison that had once started a war. The empire had been defeated, but the addiction remained victorious. Opium was no longer contraband. It had become an industry. British merchants, now operating freely under the protection of the treaty, built grand warehouses along the new treaty ports, stone structures that smelled of both salt and rot, where crates of poppy resin were stacked higher than the men who carried them. The same drug that had been called a foreign poison was now taxed, regulated, and absorbed into the bloodstream of the empire it had nearly destroyed. In India, the poppy fields spread even wider. Farmers who once grew rice and wheat now bent under the shimmering flowers of empire, their harvests weighed and measured not in grain but in pain. Entire villages lived at the mercy of the company's demands, and the rivers ran thick with the waste of refining houses. The profits flowed upward, through the ports, through the banks of London, through the drawing rooms where gentlemen discussed morality and trade beneath paintings of ships and kings. In Britain itself, a strange irony took root. As the empire drowned half the world in opium, its own citizens began to sip at the same poison in their medicine. Laudanum, a sweetened tincture of opium, became a household remedy, sold in every apothecary, prescribed for coughs, hysteria, sleeplessness, and grief. Mothers gave it to crying children. Poets drank it for inspiration. Factory workers swallowed it to endure the endless grind of industrial life. And thus, the drug that had enslaved millions abroad began to whisper its lullabies in the heart of London itself. The line between commerce and conscience blurred until no one could tell the difference. The same substance that soothed the pains of empire had built the empire's wealth, and as the decades passed, the addiction spread in new forms: morphine, heroin, synthetic derivatives, each one a new mask for the same old dream, the desire to escape. Meanwhile, in China, something darker was growing. The humiliation of defeat became a national wound that refused to close. Each new treaty, unequal and unmerciful, deepened it further. The word sovereignty became a memory, a ghost of something once sacred. By the end of the 19th century, China was no longer the Middle Kingdom, but a fractured land divided by spheres of influence, carved up by empires that had learned that war could be fought with contracts and tariffs as easily as with guns. And yet, even through the smoke, resistance flickered. Scholars began to speak of reform, of self-strengthening, of machines and knowledge and factories, of taking the weapons of the West and turning them into tools for survival. In the villages, secret societies rose, men who whispered oaths under candlelight, who dreamed of a day when the foreigners would be driven into the sea. But the shadow of opium never truly left. It lingered in the lungs, in the language, in the rhythm of despair that haunted the empire for generations. History remembers wars as battles of nations, but the Opium Wars were something else, a battle of illusions. The illusion that one could build civilization on the suffering of another. The illusion that progress had no price. The illusion that human greed could ever be contained by law or distance. And in that illusion, both East and West became prisoners. For the British, it was the addiction to empire itself, the constant hunger for new markets, new territories, new dominion. For the Chinese, it was the addiction to memory, the endless mourning for a golden past that could never return. By the dawn of the 20th century, the smoke that had once curled over the harbours of Canton had become a shadow over the entire Middle Kingdom, a shadow that no wind could scatter. The dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries now stood trembling on its last legs, not because of a single battle or rebellion, but because of something far slower, deeper, and more poisonous: the erosion of faith. For generations, the Qing emperors had ruled by the mandate of heaven, a sacred belief that their virtue maintained the harmony of the world. But what happens when heaven looks away? What happens when smoke rises where incense once burned, when temples are filled not with prayers but with the quiet rustle of addicts fumbling for their pipes? The answer unfolded slowly, like the decay of a great monument, brick by brick, heart by heart. The British were not alone anymore. The Americans came next, then the French, then the Russians and the Germans, each carving out their slice of the dying dragon. They called it the Century of Humiliation, and for good reason. Foreign gunboats patrolled the rivers. Foreign flags flew over Chinese soil. Foreign merchants ruled the ports where once mandarins had walked with the calm assurance of eternity. And in the countryside, peasants whispered that the spirits of their ancestors had turned away in sorrow. The opium still flowed, not as contraband now, but as a habit too deep to break. Entire villages had grown dependent on its comfort. Fathers smoked before bed, mothers took it to numb the ache of hunger. Even soldiers kept pipes in their packs. What had begun as a weapon of empire had become a refuge from despair. But despair does not remain quiet forever. In the final years of the 19th century, in the northern plains scorched by famine and foreign intrusion, a new kind of anger began to rise. Raw, desperate, and mystical. They called themselves the Boxers, peasants and labourers who believed that through ritual, training and faith they could summon divine power to drive out the foreign devils who had poisoned their land. They carried charms instead of rifles, swords instead of muskets, and a fury that came not from politics but from humiliation. In 1900, that fury burst into flame. Churches burned, missionaries fled, foreign compounds were surrounded. The Qing court, torn between fear and opportunity, hesitated, and that hesitation sealed its fate. When the foreign powers struck back, they did so with the cold precision of industry. Armies from 8 nations marching under different flags, but a single purpose: to punish. Beijing was looted, its palaces desecrated, its treasures carted off to museums half a world away. And when the smoke cleared, the dynasty was broken. The last emperor, a child in silk robes, sat on a throne that had already turned to dust beneath him. The courtiers whispered of reform, of modern armies and steel ships, but it was too late. The opium that had once flowed through China's veins had done its work, not only in the body, but in the spirit. In 1911, the dragon fell. The Qing dynasty, once radiant beneath the heavens, collapsed under the weight of its own silence. The empire of Confucius and porcelain and poets was gone, replaced by something new, something uncertain, something restless. The war that had begun a lifetime earlier over boxes of poppy resin had ended by reshaping the entire order of the world. The British Empire would soon feel its own slow unravelling, for no empire built on vice can last forever. India would rise, colonies would crumble. The same currents that carried opium eastward would, in time, carry independence westward. And China, broken but not destroyed, would remember. It would rebuild, reform, revolt, and rediscover its ancient strength beneath the layers of shame and smoke. For every century of humiliation, another of awakening would follow. History, after all, is not a straight line. It is a tide, and though it recedes, it always returns. In the shimmering glass towers of modern Hong Kong, neon light spills like liquid fire over the harbour, where British warships once anchored, and where now container ships glide silently, carrying the same promise of trade, faster, cleaner, legal, but still wrapped in the same old hunger. The island that was once seized as spoils of a drug war now stands as one of the world's great crossroads of finance, its skyline built upon the bones of empire, its people walking streets named after governors long forgotten, its markets forever echoing the sound of deals struck in distant tongues. Yet if you stand by the harbour at night, and the fog rolls in from the South China Sea, you might imagine you can still see it, the faint outline of sails in the mist, the low hum of cannons at rest, and the ghosts of merchants who believed they could turn smoke into destiny. Because in truth, the opium wars never really ended. They simply changed their names. Today, the poisons are different, refined, pharmaceutical, or digital, but the logic remains the same. Nations still chase profit across oceans. Corporations still trade in dependency, addiction, and distraction. The ships are faster now, the substance is legal, but the human heart has not changed. It still hungers, it still bargains, it still looks for escape. In the quiet hours you can trace the same patterns: the farmers in Bengal, replaced by workers in factories; the addicts in Canton, replaced by consumers scrolling through endless lights; the empire of poppies, replaced by an empire of pixels and pills. And the question that haunted Lin Zexu 2 centuries ago: what is the price of profit when the soul of a nation is at stake? Still drifts, unanswered, across the water. History, after all, has no true past. It only changes its disguises. Every generation believes itself free, enlightened, modern. yet every age builds its own form of opium. For some, it is wealth. For others, power. For many, it is the simple comfort of forgetting. But forgetting is dangerous, because beneath the shining surface of every empire lies the same truth, that the most destructive wars are not fought with armies or cannons, but with ideas, with greed, and with silence. So when you think of the Opium Wars, do not imagine only ships and gunpowder and treaties. Imagine instead a man in a quiet room, lighting a pipe, seeking peace in the smoke that will eventually consume him. Imagine the empires that stood behind him, one selling, one buying, both believing they had found the key to eternity. And imagine how easily we repeat the same ritual, century after century, believing we are different because our poisons are wrapped in glass and law instead of wood and gunpowder. The war began with smoke, it ended in silence, and in that silence the world was reborn, not wiser, not kinder, but forever marked by the scent of what it had burned to get here. So sleep now, under the same sky that once carried sails and storms and dreams of empire. The waves outside still whisper the same question they whispered in 1839. What does it mean to win, if what you conquer is your own conscience? Time, like smoke, has a way of circling back upon itself. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since Lin Zexu poured the poison into the Pearl River, and yet the same questions he asked still hang, unspoken, in the humid air of the modern world. We live surrounded by noise, by light, by the illusion of progress. But underneath, the old rhythm remains, the rhythm of trade, desire, and denial. The same heartbeat that once throbbed in the holds of British clippers now hums in the circuitry of servers and screens. Where once poppies bloomed in Bengal, now factories hum in Shenzhen. The hands that once picked the flowers of empire now assemble the devices that keep its memory alive. And through those glowing rectangles a new kind of opium flows, digital this time, invisible but no less potent, drip-fed through dopamine and design, feeding a hunger that never truly ends. The irony is almost perfect. The empire that once sold smoke now sells attention. The nation that once was forced to kneel has risen to command the engines of the modern world. But beneath the progress, beneath the glass and steel, the same old ghosts still drift. Whispers of greed and humiliation, pride and pain, circling endlessly between east and west, as if the world itself was still trying to exhale what it once inhaled too deeply. In the harbours of Hong Kong, the old British stone buildings stand beside towers of blue light, their colonial crests fading but not forgotten. Tourists walk past bronze statues of Queen Victoria, oblivious to the irony that the same city which once symbolized domination now embodies resilience. Beneath the noise of trams and the rush of markets, the ghosts of the Opium Age watch quietly, their faces blurred by the passage of time, but their message still clear. Empires do not die, they dissolve into habits. And what, after all, is history if not a cycle of dependency? Nations rise on ambition and fall into excess. They justify cruelty in the name of progress, then call it civilization. They enslave others to luxury, then become enslaved by their own. Each age believes its vices are unique, when in truth they are only modern translations of the same ancient sins. The British no longer rule the seas, but the dream of global dominance still sails beneath new flags. China, once the patient scholar of the East, now builds cities that glow like constellations, where factories run without rest, and where power hums through invisible networks, silent, tireless, unfeeling. The roles have shifted, the wheel has turned, yet the essence remains the same, the endless human desire to control, to consume, to forget. And somewhere, in that quiet space between forgetting and remembering, the story of the Opium Wars continues, not as a chapter of the past, but as a mirror for the present. The faces have changed, the goods have changed, the methods have changed, but the pattern remains, a transaction, a dependency, a silence. Perhaps one day, centuries from now, historians will look back on us the way we now look upon Lin Zexu's world, bewildered at how we allowed ourselves to be ruled by what we craved, at how easily we mistook convenience for freedom. They will see our glowing cities, our pills and screens and luxuries, and realize that we too were empires of smoke, just made of brighter colors. Because every civilization believes it stands above those that came before, and yet every one of them leaves behind the same faint scent of burned dreams, forgotten mercy, and the soft sweetness of addiction. The story of the Opium Wars is not about China or Britain alone. It is the story of all of us, of how every generation builds its own altar, lights its own incense, and breathes deeply of the illusion that what we desire cannot destroy us. And somewhere, in the stillness after midnight, when the city is quiet and the waves brush softly against the shore, you might almost hear it again. The sigh of the Pearl River, the distant echo of cannon fire, the unending whisper of history saying the same thing over and over. Be careful what you trade for peace. Be careful what you smoke to forget. And now the river sleeps. Its waters, once bitter with opium and lime, drift quietly beneath the bridges of modern cities, carrying only the reflections of light. No more ships anchored in its depth, no more smoke curling from the decks, no more cries of merchants arguing in foreign tongues, only silence now, a silence thick with memory. The Pearl River has seen it all, the birth of empire, the fall of dynasties, the trembling of nations that thought themselves eternal. It remembers the night when barrels were broken open and the black resin of empire poured into its heart. It remembers the thunder of cannons, the weeping of soldiers, the quiet dignity of Lin Zexu standing alone against the tide. But time, like water, carries even sorrow away. What was once fury is now silt. What was once humiliation has become sediment, layers of memory pressed beneath the feet of a new generation who no longer see the ghosts, who no longer taste the bitterness that once stained the sea. And yet, if you listen closely, in the stillness before dawn, when even the harbour lights seem to fade, you can hear the whisper of the past, soft as breath. History does not vanish. It drifts. Empires do not die, they dream. And those dreams, sweet and dangerous, still shape the tides that cradle the world. Perhaps that is how it must be. Perhaps humanity cannot exist without forgetting. Perhaps progress depends on the gentle mercy of amnesia, on our ability to move forward without fully understanding what it cost. But the river remembers, and so does the smoke. It lingers in the air we breathe, in the stories we tell, in the faint ache of guilt that every civilization hides beneath its monuments. It drifts above the tea houses of the present and the opium dens of the past, reminding us that there is no such thing as victory without loss, and no such thing as peace without memory. So close your eyes now. Let the world of cannons, smoke and porcelain fade away. The ships have long since vanished, the poppies have turned to dust, and even the empires that fought to control them have been swallowed by time. What remains are the ripples, gentle, endless, eternal. And in those ripples you can almost hear it, the faint exhale of a sleeping river, the sigh of history itself. A sound too soft for guilt, too deep for pride, and too beautiful to ever truly forget. The war began with smoke and ended in silence, but in that silence the world learned what power truly costs. Even after the river sleeps, its dreams continue, drifting out to sea, mingling with the tides that circle the world. Somewhere between the waters of Bengal and the Pacific, the echoes of that long-ago trade still whisper beneath the waves, faint as a heartbeat beneath the surface. For history never ends. It only changes its voice. The British sailors who once steered their opium clippers through storms are gone now, their bones long dissolved into the salt of the ocean, yet their wake still lingers, invisible but eternal. Every ship that crosses those same waters carries a trace of their shadow. Every port that hums with commerce still vibrates faintly with the same question that haunted the 19th century. What is the difference between trade and theft, between progress and destruction? The world today hums with speed, fibre optics instead of sails, algorithms instead of compasses, invisible empires made of data instead of colonies made of land. And yet, the moral geometry remains unchanged. We still measure our success by how much we can extract how much we can sell, how much we can own. Only the products have evolved, the appetite has not. In the glow of our screens, we rarely see the hands behind them. The factories that hum through the night, the rivers that choke on waste, the quiet exhaustion of those who feed the engines of a civilization that refuses to sleep. If the 19th century was an age of opium, perhaps ours is an age of noise, a constant narcotic hum that numbs instead of heals, that distracts instead of enlightens. And maybe, deep down, that is the real legacy of the Opium Wars. Not just the memory of imperial greed, but the discovery that silence itself can be weaponized. The smoke has changed its colour, but not its purpose. It no longer drifts from pipes or poppies. It glows from glass, blue, bright, and infinite. It seeps into our homes through the gentle hum of screens, into our minds through the soft promise of connection, until even our dreams are shaped by its rhythm. And perhaps, somewhere far below the surface, the river sighs again, aware that humanity has never learned to live without illusions, only to replace them. For history is not a story we tell, it is a current we live inside. It moves beneath us, unseen, carrying the debris of all that we have been, the wars, the trades, the dreams, the smoke. It never stops, it never forgets, it only deepens. And if you listen, truly listen, beneath the hum of your own life, you might still hear it, the quiet splash of an oar in the distance, the rattle of a chest being opened, the soft exhale of a man lighting his pipe in the dark, believing, as we all do, that he is only borrowing peace. The river keeps its secrets, the empire keeps its ghosts, and the smoke, it never really fades. The sea at night does not remember flags, it does not remember kings or borders or treaties. It only remembers light, the brief trembling glow that ships once carried across its surface before they vanished beyond the horizon. For centuries, empires have come and gone across these same waters, each believing their light would never fade. But the ocean is patient. It outlives even arrogance. The British lanterns that once guided opium fleets now flicker only in memory, their oil long spent, their captains long forgotten. The Chinese harbours they once approached are now cities of glass and neon, shining brighter than any torch the empire ever held. And yet, when the wind shifts, the sea still smells faintly of smoke. That smoke is not just history, it is inheritance. It drifts through time, reshaping itself with every generation, a whisper in a classroom, a faint bitterness in a teacup, a question in the heart of a traveller who looks out at the sea and wonders how something so vast could have been used for something so small. And still, we build. We build new towers, new markets, new forms of empire, invisible, algorithmic, global, each one promising peace through progress, comfort through consumption, meaning through connection. We are the new merchants now, and our ships are made of data, our cargo made of attention. The ocean watches as it always has. It listens to our promises, our justifications, our illusions. And it waits, because the sea knows what we forget, that every empire, no matter how gilded, is only a reflection trembling on the water. When the wind changes, the image breaks, and what remains is not victory or defeat, but the quiet truth that no power lasts longer than compassion, and no trade is worth the price of a human soul. So tonight, as the world turns and the rivers whisper to the sea, imagine the last ship fading into the fog, its lantern dimming, its sails dissolving into darkness. The waves close behind it without a sound, erasing its path but not its story. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the same wind that once carried smoke now carries sleep. Close your eyes. Let the tide take you. History will still be here in the morning, waiting, gentle, patient, eternal. Because history never truly ends, it only rests, and in the hush between one wave and the next, the empire exhales its final breath, soft as smoke, light as forgiveness, and so the smoke drifts on, no longer black with sorrow, no longer bitter with war, but silver now, soft like breath in the moonlight. It rises above the sleeping cities, above the oceans that once divided empires, above the clouds where silence finally becomes gentle. Somewhere in that stillness, the ghosts of merchants and emperors pass each other without fear. The hands that once signed treaties now release them. The waves that once carried cannons now cradle stars. Even the river, that patient witness of human hunger, has forgiven us, because in the end everything returns to quiet. Even ambition, even shame, even empire. The world, for all its noise, is made of the same fragile dust, the dust of poppy petals, the dust of bones, the dust of dreams too heavy to hold. And as it settles, as it becomes memory, it asks nothing of us except to remember, not the power, not the victory, but the silence that followed. That silence is not empty. It is the sound of understanding, the sound of a world exhaling, softly after too long holding its breath. So close your eyes now. Let the smoke fade. Let the wars dissolve into whispers, the rivers into sleep, the stars into stillness. And know that somewhere far beyond the tides and time and sorrow, history is dreaming of peace.